All right, I think we're right at the top of the hour, but we can maybe give a minute or two as folks are joining. Thanks everyone for being here. We really appreciate. Excited to see some familiar names in the chat and some new faces too. All right, what do you think, Phil? Should we dive in?
All right, sounds good. Should we get started?
Let's do it.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on state approaches to short-term credentials. I'm Phil Olif with the Pew Charitable Trusts, and over about the last year, we've had the privilege of supporting and being a thought partner to Christina Sedney and the team at WICHE as they develop the really important work that we're going to talk about today. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to really briefly give an overview of the rationale for the project. Then I'm going to turn it over to Christina to talk through the key findings. And then Christina is going to introduce our fabulous panel of experts to talk about the role of states and other stakeholders in shaping the short-term credential landscape. So it should be a really interesting discussion, really engaging discussion today. And it's a really critical time to be having this conversation. The imperfect data that we have at our disposal suggests that there's been a real spike in interest in shorter term and non-degree post-secondary options in recent years. And just to cite a quick example, the latest data from the National Student Clearinghouse finds that the share of first-time undergraduate completers earning a certificate has grown from about 1 in 9 to 1 in 7 over just the last decade. And state investments in these programs also seem to have surged in recent years. States are currently investing $5.6 billion to support short-term programs in 2024, and that's up from $4 billion in 2023, according to some really helpful research from HCM strategists. Short-term programs offer the promise of a direct, flexible pathway to advancement in the workforce. But when we look at the limited data we have on outcomes of these programs, we find that the results are mixed. As Michelle Van Noy, who served as an advisor on this project, and her team have pointed out, some studies find wage gains for students who have attended shorter-term programs, but other studies have not. And Michelle and her team suggest that factors like field of study, regional variation, and differences in data and research methods across different studies may play a role in these varied results. Adding to the confusion around the value proposition of these programs is the fact that oftentimes students who attend them aren't eligible for traditional forms of financial support like federal Pell Grants or federal loans. And that increases the chances that students need to rely on alternative financing mechanisms like income share agreements or even credit cards to pay for them. It also may raise the odds that they need to take on substantial debt to pay for a program of questionable value. And under these circumstances, it's really critical for policymakers to think about how to strike the right balance between encouraging enrollment in these programs while also ensuring transparency and quality. So students know what they're getting when they sign up for short-term programs, and employers understand what skills these programs actually impart. And states are really at the front lines of ensuring that policy balance. Really, the goal of the WICHE paper was to lay out all the ways that state policy intersects with the landscape of short-term credentials and provide examples of the ways that states are leveraging the policy tools at their disposal to shape that short-term credential landscape in line with their policy goals. So I want to commend Christina and the WICHE team for producing such a clear and comprehensive report. And I will turn it over to Christina to talk about the key findings from the report.
Sorry about that. Great. Thanks so much, Phil. And so I'm going to take a little bit of time again to walk through the findings from the report. But first, wanted to start with a really big thank you. It's been a real privilege to learn from some real experts, from institutional leaders, practitioners, state policymakers, and national experts, a handful of whom we have with us today joining us for this conversation and many more. And we really learned so much from them, and they really enabled us to build our understanding of this landscape. So I wanted to start out with a big thank you to them and to our partners at Pew on this work. And sorry, I'm just going to go ahead and share a couple slides as we walk through this. I wanted to begin with just a quick introduction to WICHE itself, just to kind of explain a little bit, why we were interested in this work, who we are and why we care. So, as many of you know, but some of you may not, WICHE is an interstate regional compact. We were created over 70 years ago. And our goal is to support higher education across the region. And we do that in a number of different ways, but in particular by facilitating the sharing of resources, supporting the development of sound public policy, and fostering collaborative innovation. And at WICHE, we run a wide range of programs and initiatives, but my team in particular focuses on policy analysis and research in areas of interest to our states, and particularly those issues that are of interest to multiple members and those that might have interstate implications. And I can tell you short-term credentials are definitely one of those issues. You can see in the state range that we serve, it's North and South Dakota all the way out to Hawaii and the Pacific territories and freely associated states. So there are some very different economic, demographic, political contexts represented in our membership, but short-term credentials are actually a hot topic really in every single one of these places. We do see that playing out in different ways. So in some cases, folks are interested in short-term credentials as a way to draw traditional age students into post-secondary education. In other cases, it's attracting older working learners into the space, into post-secondary. And in some cases, it's helping folks who are looking to reskill and change careers, looking into new areas like AI. So that's why we really wanted to take some time over the past year, and again, in partnership with the wonderful team at Pew, to really explore what policy mechanisms states have in place to intersect with these credentials. How can or how could they be investing in these credentials while also providing appropriate oversight? And so, as Phil shared, the overarching issue that we saw was really this groundswell of demand on the student side and then a lack of clarity in terms of the options available to them. And then, in terms of challenges on the state side, really siloed delivery, funding, and oversight mechanisms. In addition, there's been an increasingly blurry line between provider types in this space. So we have traditional higher education, we have workforce training providers, and then we have new types of providers. So private companies, in some cases, certification providers themselves really entering this space. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing. In some ways, it's kind of a natural evolution of higher education, but it does put a lot of impetus on states to take the lead in developing really effective approaches to short term credentialing that really center students and then their community and state needs. And so, as Phil said, states are really kind of in a unique position here. So, the goal of our initial work was very much just kind of an overall scan of what states are doing, what's working well, what's not, and where are there gaps in our knowledge and understanding. And so before we dive in, I did just want to take a moment to be really clear about the terminology that we're using and why we chose it. We know there's a lot of variation and really inconsistency in this space. You've probably heard terms like micro credential, badge, nano degree, non-degree credential. The list kind of goes on and on. But depending on who is using the term and in what context, they often mean different things. So, for example, the state of Idaho's definition of a micro credential might be different from the Maricopa Community College District's definition, which is different from Coursera's definition of a micro credential. So, you might be saying the same word, but meaning something different. And at this time, there's really just not a commonly agreed upon definition in this space. And so we did just want to make sure we were clear about what we were using for the purposes of this project. And for this work, we were really focused on those credentials that kind of fall out of the traditional regulatory frameworks in higher education. So specifically Title IV participation, which offers, some national standardization in terms of participation requirements. So we chose to focus on post-secondary non-degree credentials not eligible for Title IV for this. So kind of generally speaking, that's programs below 10 weeks in or 300 clock hours in length. And there's certainly many different ways to approach this and many good reasons to look at different types of credentials. But because we were kind of focused on the more regulatory side of things, we really wanted to look at credentials where states were kind of this prime regulatory entity. So, what did we find? We found that there are a number of ways that states are intersecting with these credentials already. I would call this sort of a list of 7+ levers. The eighth one's kind of a catch-all, where states can really kind of exert an amount of influence over these types of credentials. And I'd note here that we often, and I very much include myself in this, position oversight and investment on two ends of a spectrum. But in reality, they're much more intertwined. By nature, investment choices incorporate some level of oversight. And on the flip side, states have to invest in their oversight capacity. So I did want to recognize that it's not kind of a perfect dichotomy between investment and oversight, but we will kind of use that language as we walk through. On oversight, we have state authorization. So that states rules for offering any kind of post secondary education in the state. And then we also have consumer protections from advertising to loan products, which, as Phil mentioned, we kind of see as particularly important in this space because of the lack of the traditional higher education financing mechanisms here. And that can lead to some more creative financing options, which in turn lead to more oversight considerations. On the funding side, there are a real range of options, and those can include dedicated financial aid programs. They can also include integrating per student funding, whether that's for enrollments or completions for short-term credentials into state funding models. And then also at one-time or time-limited investments, building up that infrastructure that can support these credential types. And then we also have seen a lot of momentum around developing shared quality standards. In some cases, that states using what are called their eligible training provider list to begin enacting those quality standards, which offer sort of an existing framework for authority and oversight to do that. And then there's kind of a whole catch-all bucket of all the other ways states intersect with them. And this list is broad. It includes SNAP employment and training funds, state authorizing agencies for veterans benefits, and then, of course, kind of the whole wide world of professional licensure standards. And those all to a different extent have some role to play. And that really varies depending on the field and the credential type. So I'm just going to kind of briefly walk through an example for each of these different ones, not to go too into detail, but just to kind of show you how we were seeing each of these areas apply. So on the state authorization side, one of the really key elements is language. So, how does the state define an educational entity? So, for example, in Colorado, their statutory language really broadly defines the term education and school. So, they have oversight over a whole range of private providers, whether it's an accredited institution at the sub-baccalaureate level, or a private company or provider of post-secondary education. And the way they've designed their system is they're able to self fund it via provider registration fees. They can evaluate all new and continuing providers on a routine basis, look at their baseline educational standards, look at their workforce relevance of their programming, look at the fiscal responsibility of the entity providing the education, their business practices. And in recent years, we've seen them begin to even more directly coordinate with workforce services and their eligible training provider list, which there's a pretty significant amount of provider overlap among those two. But the data they collect is not incorporated into sort of broader state data products. So kind of flagship state data products like the talent pipeline report in the state and things like that. So there's still a little bit of siloing there. On the consumer protection side, this is, we would say, kind of a newer, more emerging area. Not a ton of states have done a lot of work here, but we have seen some states begin to regulate in this. So, for example, the California Department of Financial Protection and Innovation updated their rules around student loan products, and that's to ensure that income sharing agreements are treated as loans and they're subject to kind of all the applicable state laws and protections associated with them. And they also require providers to submit annual reports. So that kind of adds another layer of data to what's going on in this space. But again, one that's often separate from kind of the traditional post secondary regulatory apparatus. On the state financial aid side, I think that's something many of us are familiar with. Many states are starting to design financial aid programs to support short-term credentials and those are growing in popularity and in size. There are a lot of examples out there right now. You might have heard of things like Virginia's Fast Forward program or Louisiana's MJ Foster Promise program. among many other. One I wanted to highlight in part because it's in our Western region is Idaho Launch. And this one I think is a particularly interesting example because it offers state funding for students to attend short-term credential programs in in-demand fields, but it's not limited to just public institutions. They can also use it at private providers as well. And so they're really focused on incentivizing students to attain some sort of credential, sort of regardless of the provider. So that will be interesting to see how that plays out over the next few years. Another area is institutional operating support. So that's, as I mentioned, kind of explicitly incorporating short-term credential enrollment or completion into a state funding formula. This is a lot less common. And it's certainly more complicated to implement. In most cases, the funding formulas are determined in state statute, but there are states that are heading in this direction. So, for example, a big one is that we saw Texas in 2023 design their community college funding formula to really focus on what they term credentials of value, and that's sort of in relation to their earnings potential and the high demand field choice. But it doesn't matter whether their program is for credit or non-credit. They receive funding for either type. And so it will be interesting to see how this kind of shifts institutional and student behavior over time in the state. Another area where we've seen a lot of activity, and particularly due to the influx in federal funds during the pandemic, are one-time or sort of time-limited funding opportunities. I'm not going to go into great detail on either of these. We've seen some interesting programs in New Mexico and Wyoming, but we're lucky enough to have experts from both states joining us. So I'll kind of table that one so we can hear directly from them on that one. But there's a lot of interesting work in that space. And then finally, on the sort of quality standards bucket, that's where it's not necessarily tied specifically to a financial aid program, but the state is establishing quality metrics for short-term credentials in their state. And Alabama has a really interesting example of that through their talent triad work. And in particular, they created a compendium of valued credentials that really explores credentials that are of value in specific fields, in specific areas in the state. And it would really encourage everybody to check that out. They've done some really thorough work there, and it's very interesting to see. And then finally, again, we have an in-house expert on this one joining us today for the panel, but eligible training provider list. So these are federally funded Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act programs. So those are from the WIOA funding pot. And they do have baseline federal standards in place, but states can kind of choose to layer on additional requirements, and the capacity they have to oversee these providers varies really widely as well. But states are really starting to use this program in new and exciting ways. And so Marina will share a little bit about Washington State's Career Bridge on that one. So those are just kind of some examples of the many, many different ways that states are already working in this space. However, we do see that there's a lot still to do moving forward. We think there are a lot of areas for future research, as well as future areas for state policy activity and potentially capacity building as well. In terms of future research, we think there are a lot of potential areas. Three we just wanted to highlight that kind of spanned states that we saw over the course of this research. One is impact over time. So, we've seen a few states make great strides. We still have a long way to go before every state has information on the short-term credential offerings within their borders and their outcomes. And there's a lot to be learned from our early adopter states and also some really emerging leaders in this space. Initiatives like CredLens, the State Non-Credit Data Project, the Multi-State Data Collaborative, and others. So a lot of great work going on here. Another area we think that will be of increasing interest is artificial intelligence. This will play out in many different ways, but we think its impact on credential choice may be particularly interesting. We know AI is already shaping how students are finding information about credentials, but we don't really know how that may or may not be skewing enrollment trends and how that might change over time and what role states might be able to play in that conversation. And then lastly, definitions of success. A recurring theme we heard was the importance of designing systems that capture student feedback on what they need and want in programs in order to make them a success in students' eyes. The National Skills Coalition has done some great work in this area, but there's definitely a lot more to do here, and certainly something to think about in the design of state programs. And then in terms of future state policy activity, no surprise, we think in-state coordination is going to continue to be critically important, making sure to bring folks from different agencies and entities together. We think executive leadership has a huge role to play here, and as well as just kind of thinking about how these levers intersect as states are designing new programs and new initiatives. And this will really be critical in terms of efficiently meeting state policy goals. And that's one of the reasons we're excited to have Lauren with us today. Also, data enhancement, again, as we noted, tracking the impact over time of these credentials is something that's just going to be critically important, and we'll really need to build this capacity in many states, and in particular, expand that to include data on private providers. And then student navigation. This really goes, we think, hand in hand with the data piece. A recurrent theme in this work, and honestly in a lot of the work that WICHE has done, is the critical importance of navigation. We know technology has a role to play, but it's really, at the end of the day, real relationships that drive its effectiveness. A website is nothing if no one's using it, if no one's helping them to use it. And we also know this is particularly challenging for adult learners. So making sure we're identifying methods of outreach for this population is going to be really important moving forward as well. And then last but not least, we think regulatory evolution is probably going to be needed. How are states adopting their laws and regulations to incorporate new models for delivering learning and making sure they're really capturing all the providers in this space? So, in summary, I would say there's a lot of innovative work going on at the state level, and um, there's even more work to do looking forward. And so, with that in mind, I really wanted to turn it over to our panel and jump into hearing from some of our state experts. And so, with that, I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and to tell us a little bit about the state they're from, the organization they're representing, and then just a little bit about how your work intersects with short-term credentials. And so, Marina, why don't I go ahead and start with you?
Thanks, Christine. It's great to be here. I'm really glad to be part of the panel. I'm the Director of Workforce System Advancement for the state's Workforce Board. And I've really been part of the Career Bridge site that we have, which you mentioned earlier in the presentation, our state's public-facing education and career portal. Since it launched, that's how long I've been here, since 2009. And we're in the midst right now of a modernization effort that's going to make it much more dynamic, user-friendly. It's going to draw in more people from across Washington to this site. To get to your other questions, I guess, about just how that fits in with short-term credentials, Career Bridge, and we could talk more about this as this panel goes on, but it folds in over 6,500 post-secondary programs, and many of our post-secondary programs that we show on Career Bridge are short-term credentials. So anything from like a 10-week Python programming course to a 1-month CNA program for certified nursing assistants. So we have always kind of built in, I think, that workforce component into Career Bridge. I think some folks here are more, more higher ed, traditional higher ed focus, but we've always wanted to have the full education spectrum on Career Bridge. So again, sometimes some of our training programs are as short as, like 72 hours even. So we're in like the hours land. So that's a micro credential, but we just want to make sure that folks have that access to all of their education options in one place. And I know we'll talk about this further in this panel, but also quality control. How do we help ensure that Washington residents are enrolling in programs that are going to pay off for them? How are we going to ensure that they take a program that doesn't just have a terminal end to it, that doesn't build to another, a bigger potential credential and more career opportunities? Those are the kinds of things we're grappling with. And then one last thing, because other folks want to talk, I'm sure. We also are very invested in overall credential transparency in Washington State. Our state's strategic workforce plan, Talent and Prosperity for All, aka TAP, addresses credential transparency as one of our key priorities. And we have a credential transparency advisory group that pulls in partners from across our system to talk about how to make sure folks are able to really see what's inside a credential, what's the value, looking at skills and competencies. And that's part of that broader credential transparency picture that we're trying to build into our new and improved Career Bridge website.
Great. Thanks so much, Marina. And Andrea, how about you?
Sure. Thanks, Christina. Hi, everybody. My name is Andrea Cisneros-Wichman. I'm a Senior Director over Workforce Training Programs with C&M Ingenuity, an organization associated with Central New Mexico Community College in Albuquerque. I've spent 14 years developing and managing short-term credentialing programs and topics ranging from renewable energy, business leadership. Most of my time spent managing technology training programs. We were the first or one of the first colleges in the country to offer coding boot camps. Still somewhat involved in those programs today, where I lead a team that's developing a quantum technician boot camp, for example, probably about a 300-hour program that we're very excited to work on right now. In my role right now, I mostly work on new program development, lots of grants and funding strategies, so I'm very familiar with these conversations we're having at a national level about how are people paying for these short-term credentials and what does that look like, with a goal in mind for me to make it accessible to every learner who wants to take advantage of different training opportunities.
Great, thanks so much. And Lauren.
Hi, my name is Lauren Schoenfeld. I'm excited to be here today. I am a senior policy advisor for Governor Gordon in Wyoming. I work on economic development and workforce development, and then I'm also run a key initiative that was started under Governor Gordon's tenure here called the Wyoming Innovation Partnership. And so that's mostly where our focus will be today. And the Wyoming Innovation Partnership was started in 2021. And it was kind of at the end of the COVID cuts and everything. And so really it was looking to pull together higher education with economic development, workforce development, as well as our K-12 partners to support industry across the state of Wyoming. And as you all know, short-term credentials and many of the CTE programming, they're very expensive to stand up. And we expect higher education on an industry side to act very agilely. And that requires a coordinated effort. And so really, the Wyoming Innovation Partnership has worked over the past few years to really focus that effort. We've also been very driven by metrics and data to ensure that the impact that we're making does create a return on investment for the state of Wyoming. And I think that's been very important as we've looked at investment of state dollars. The state of Wyoming has invested about $77 million into this program over the past few years. That's a lot of money. And we have to show them that we're being successful with that funding and that it is creating a return on investment so that they can understand as we move forward into this world of shorter term credentials as our higher education education institutions are moving agilely and that they need to be funded adequately. And so we've really focused on, what does that look like for the state of Wyoming? We have focused the programmatic efforts that we've worked on around sectors of workforce need and have really looked at industry partnerships and collaboration across higher education institutions. We are also working currently on putting together a process of scaling these programs. So if we see a program that's working really well and it's a workforce need for the entire state of Wyoming, how do we scale these programs in an efficient way? And I don't think any of the programs are going to look exactly alike. But another interesting fact about Wyoming is that all of our higher education institutions, the community college education institutions, are all run by a college district. And so it's a tax district with local elected officials as their boards of trustees. And so about half of their income comes from their tax district and the other half comes from the state legislature funding. And so the dynamics there don't require them to collaborate or work together or share even information. And it allows for local control, which is great. But that was part of the impetus behind the work that we're doing, is to find where we can work better together to really push these efforts forward and support economic development across the state of Wyoming. So I'm excited to dig a little more into that as we go through this.
Well, great. Thanks so much. And I think we're so lucky to have the three of you here kind of representing these complementary but different perspectives. So the workforce side, the provider side, the gubernatorial side. And so really looking forward to that conversation. And I'm curious from where you sit, why do you think short-term credentials are important? I think some of you kind of touched on that slightly in your answers, but I'd love to dig into that a little more, kind of today, but then also looking towards the future. And Andrea, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. So I think they're important from different perspectives. For our learners, they want training fast. They want jobs fast. Job changers in particular no longer want to go to school for 2 to 4 years. They want to reskill quickly, or work and continue to reskill while they're working. So we need to deliver our training faster. For employers, similar, they don't want to wait forever for their workforce to be ready, but especially with advancements in technology and manufacturing, the industry is moving more towards skill-based hiring, and we need to be able to provide those skills much faster than we have in the past. And we need a way to validate those skills so employers know that they're of quality. And for the colleges, short-term credentials, particularly our like non-credit programs, are designed to be innovative, adapt quickly to industry needs, and designed to be economically self-sufficient in a way that traditional academic programs are not. So important for all of those reasons. Short-term credentials don't look the same now as they did when I started 14 years ago, and I know they will continue to evolve pretty rapidly here.
Great, thank you. Marina or Lauren, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I love your comments, Andrea. That was really encapsulated a lot of the things that we think about here in Washington as well. I also think so much of this is obviously market driven, like you were saying. Job seekers, job changers, they don't want to necessarily sit for 2 more years or 4 years in a classroom. They want to get specific skills. Employers are looking for specific skills, and that's something that we see in workforce development. Employers are saying we need to have XYZ, and then sometimes the institutions may not deliver exactly XYZ. So we're trying to bridge that, career bridge, but make sure that both sides are talking to each other so those skills are readily apparent for the person who's the worker as well as the employer. And I think, that mention of skills-based hiring, that's just going to keep continuing on. That's the marketplace. And so we have to be responsive to that marketplace, both from the employer side and the worker side, the student side. So that's a key piece of why short-term credentials are so important. And it's a reason that I've personally seen with CareerBridge, institutions reaching out to us to say, look, we have these non-credit certificate programs. We want to make sure now that those programs are on CareerBridge. I know I spoke separately to Christina about this the other day. In our state, those credentials are not housed in the data warehouse with the 4 credit credentials our system has. So for example, our community college system, all of their non-credit certificate programs are separate. And that means that when we do business with the continuing ed folks, they have to submit their information directly to us, the workforce board, through our secure encrypted student data portal. And we do this every year. It's a lot of extra effort though. So I'm looking at, is there a way that we could pull that information into the general data warehouse so that there's just more exposure to these different programs? So that's just one thing I would point out in this conversation. I know that's probably true for other states as well, but there's been this kind of weird siloing of, these are continuing ed, they're non-credit, we think of them differently. And because of that, we don't have as much access to that data, and then we can't make it as available to our population as we would like.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Lauren?
Yeah, sure. All of those have been great comments. So Wyoming fairly recently, the Wyoming Business Council worked on a research project, and it really looked at good paying jobs within the state of Wyoming and what the educational requirements are of those. We have a lot of industry in the state of Wyoming, and a lot of agriculture, and the majority of the good paying jobs in the state do not require a 4-year degree. They are requiring credentials, they're requiring certifications. And so that's been, I think big eye opener for us, in that we've been pushing and supporting higher education institutions for more 2-year degree, more 4-year degrees, but that's not what the data is showing us is really necessary for our citizens in Wyoming to stay in Wyoming and get great paying jobs. And thus that supports our industries across the state of Wyoming. And so while not taking away from those 2- and 4-year degrees, because we do know how important those are, I think that there's a rising awareness of how important and essential these credentials are. And we're working currently on a digital wallet that is allowing support of even stackable credentials through our K-12 system. And how do we set our high school students up even for graduation and then going directly into the workforce if that's what they want to do? And then another thing that I'll touch on too that Marina kind of talked about is that looking kind of at career pathways. And how do we ensure that our students know what jobs are available in the state of Wyoming and what their pathway is to get to that job? So whether they want to be a doctor or they want to be a welder and a pipe fitter, those are both great options and they both pay great salaries. How do we ensure that they have the opportunity to look at what funding opportunities and scholarship opportunities are available? Wyoming also has a great thing that our K-12 students have free access to higher education while they're in high school. And so allowing them and supporting them and ensuring that they get those right pathways in place, I think is really important and really a big part of this conversation as well, as we look at building this out and verifying those credentials and things like that. So.
Thanks, Lauren. And I think we started off pretty positively, which is great. And I think there's a lot of potential here, but there are also a lot of unknowns out there. So I guess I just ask you to reflect a little bit on, from your perspective, what are sort of the most concerning unknowns? Like, what do you not know right now about short-term credentials that you would like to know in order to provide better, more effective credentials moving forward? Maybe we'll go in reverse order. Lauren, I don't know if you want to jump back in on that one.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, so I think that there's 2 things that really come to mind, and that's how do we figure out an easier way, a better way of funding this, and that's both for our students and for our institutions that are providing this education. I think that's a huge unknown. It's scary for both sides, and it's kind of out there, and I think that there's a way to do that, and that leads to my second big unknown, and part of that is really ensuring that we are meeting industry needs and really engaging with our industry partners. And I'm just going to jump kind of into just a story about some experience that I've had in Wyoming, not even specific with the Wyoming Innovation Partnership, but we have Next Gen sector partners through our Workforce Development Council have been supported. And there's one in the southwest corner of Wyoming, and they partnered, that sector partnership was a manufacturing partnership, and they are run by industry partners. And they partnered heavily once they recognized that they needed a operator certificate program. They partnered heavily with the community college there in the community and supported putting together, the curriculum, ensuring that it met everybody's needs from an industry standpoint. And then they actually paid their employees to go through this program. Now this program doesn't require that anymore. It is self-sustained without the industry support. But I just want to point out that industry funded that program to be stood up. They funded the students to go through it because they recognized the importance, because they had the buy-in and they helped build that. And I think if we can look at creative ways of doing that across the states, that might be an easy way to pay for and get the engagement of students and industry in the whole process.
Thanks, Lauren. And Marina, how about you? Any sort of concerning unknowns out there?
Concerning unknowns, I mean, I think it just continues to be making sure that these short-term credentials have value. I mean, this is sort of the gist of the credential conversation writ large, which is we don't want people just to be, okay, that sounds good, but then it doesn't result in career advancement or doesn't result in a bigger paycheck or results in them not being able to pay back their debt. So it becomes more difficult. It's great. I mean, choice is awesome. Like the more choices you have, the better, right? But if some of those choices are leading people into debt and they're not getting what they really think they're getting, that's a problem. That's a consumer protection problem that we take seriously here at Washington's Workforce Board. We really want to make sure that there's value. So That's going to be, I think, our biggest thing going forward. You mentioned the eligible training provider list, and CareerBridge is home of our state's eligible training provider list. So many of the programs that we show on this site have been through that process, meaning that our research staff independently evaluate these programs for performance, employment outcomes, earnings outcomes, completion rates, what industry do people go to work in. But for the programs that are not on the eligible training provider list, there's a lot more unknowns, right? We don't really know for sure how well those programs perform. So I guess one of my personal thoughts, are we allowed to have personal thoughts on this thing? Yes, I would love this, just FYI, I would love it someday for our state to basically say, Washington Workforce Board, we want you to evaluate all post-secondary programs for performance. We are directing you to do this work because we do this work in pieces right now. You know, if someone says, yes, I want to be on the state's eligible training provider list, they send us the information, we do this data match, our research staff does this data match, and we come out with independently evaluated performance results that people can hang their hat on. Gold standard, right, for performance accountability. But this is a hit and miss area right now because many programs, for whatever reason, maybe they just don't want the hassle of submitting the data, aren't going to do it. But if some state, maybe ours will be the first, says, you know what, we think this is really important, we're going to require that. And we could tell you, we could then post performance results for all these different levels of post-secondary programs. So that's my pitch.
All right. And just to clarify for our audience, Marina, when you say data match, that's with wage outcome data from your employment security department?
Yes, that's right. Thank you for clarifying that. So we take student level records and then we do that match with our wage records. And because I often tell people this, because we have this federal requirement from the U.S. Department of Labor to do this work, we're able to look across all 50 states, which is great. So if you have a program in Washington and the students go to Florida or Oregon or Idaho or wherever, we're still tracking performance for those programs because we have access to wage records from all 50 states for this process.
No, that's definitely an incredible resource. All right. And Andrea.
So a few thoughts here. I think one of the biggest reasons there are so many unknowns in this space has to do with our language. Christina and Phil, you kind of talked about this in the beginning, but even the terminology we use is just not consistent. It's not consistent, and there are just so many blurred lines now between higher education, workforce, credentials, micro-credentials. Learners don't just do one thing. There's a pathway that involves all of those things, however you define them. So the language makes it complicated. It's a very vast landscape. For-profit training providers have bigger marketing budgets than we do, which I think confuses learners or makes it more complicated for them to know which credentialing programs are of higher quality. Lauren, you gave a great example of how employers are invested and when they value these credentials. Another example, we're working with General Mills right now on some industrial automation, machine tool welding training. We have a big General Mills plant here in Albuquerque. They've invested in this. They've co-created the curriculum with us in many ways. So I know they value what we're doing, but it doesn't mean that every employer has bought into what short-term training can actually do for their employees. Like Marina touched on, we have to get better at collecting the data and evaluating the outcomes of these programs. I've spent a year studying this and learning what other states are doing, and realized that at CNN we're doing this better than a lot of colleges, which kind of makes me sad because I know we aren't doing as perfect as we want to do either. So this is a big challenge. And then just overall sustainability of funding. New Mexico has invested a lot of money from the state legislature in workforce training, and yet there wasn't really a strategy with what that means when it's combined with WIOA and these other resources. And so we're struggling to kind of figure that out as we go. So definitely a lot of work to do as we continue to navigate this space.
And Andrea, could you share a little bit more about that state investment, just its overall size and what it was intended to do?
Sure. So New Mexico State Legislature appropriated $60 million over 3 years last year to pay for student tuition for workforce training courses that are not eligible for any other financial aid. 60 million over 3 years, but it was delivered to the schools based on the population. So being here in Albuquerque, our college got the majority of that funding. It's an investment like we have never seen before in New Mexico. I failed to mention a little bit in the beginning that CNM Ingenuity is part of a nonprofit organization developed under the New Mexico Research Park Act, which means we deliver the workforce training under the umbrella of Central New Mexico Community College. And we've been doing this for 10 years now. And I think this investment from the state was in many ways based on our success and our reputation in carrying the state forward and how training can look different. And I was thinking about it. I like how your report, I was reading about it again, the WICHE report talked about linking institutional operational support to ways to deliver short-term credentials differently, and how that can incentivize institutional behavior. And I think the investment in CNM and creating CNM Ingenuity and the investment in our state in workforce training is absolutely changing the behavior and how we deliver training and how we fund it. But that money's not going to be recurring if I don't figure out a way to show that there really is a strong return on investment here. So that goes back to just a better need for data and outcomes post-training, which we're focusing very heavily on right now.
And sorry, I just think that's so interesting. One last follow-up question. What do you need that you don't have?
Ooh, that's a great question. We have a very good approach to collecting this data. We recently, through our Division of Workforce and Community Success, hired a financial analyst, a data analyst who's now like dedicated to working on this. So that was huge for us, just kind of having the infrastructure and the capacity to do this work. Our approach is using a combination of wage records, surveying of our learners, and surveys followed up by phone calls when they don't answer the surveys, and then utilizing some technology to try to kind of bring all of that together. Marina, super interesting to hear that y'all have a way to go cross state lines to collect some of that information, because I don't think we have access to that in New Mexico. So now I'm very curious to learn more about that.
And Maria, do you just want to talk quickly about that?
Hopefully I'm correct about this, but we typically have been collecting data from across all 50 states because of the ETPL, because of the eligible training provider list, which is a U.S. Department of Labor requirement. And so that enables us to access wage records from the 50 states. Obviously, we don't get to go to out of the country, but still 50 states is pretty good. So Andrea, we can talk more offline, I guess, about it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And we do have a couple questions from our audience. I want to make sure we get to those before we wrap up. And so Philip Martin was wondering how employers that hire people into good jobs, so high wage, paid leave, health and retirement benefits, inform states and credential providers in terms of which skills and credentials they're looking for, and any examples of short-term credential programs that have the biggest payoff in the labor market compared to bachelor's degrees. And those are kind of, I would say, two, maybe that first component. So how are the employers informing states and credential providers? Lauren, I'm wondering if maybe you have some thoughts on that, given the examples you shared.
Yeah, so the research that the Wyoming Business Council was a part of took a number of different, they overlaid I'm trying to think, the degrees that were available, and then they also overlaid what jobs were projected from our workforce services and our labor market trends. There was a significant number of overlay of data on that. I don't have all of the exact details of that report specifically, but I could dig it out and share it with Christina if you want that additional information. I will say that every single one of our community colleges have a working group that they pull together of industry partners. It's a partnership advisory group, and they pull them together. I believe it's every semester. And they talk about what their needs are, and that gives the employers the opportunity to talk about it. We also have a governor's business forum that convenes a significant number of Wyoming employers there. We've done a lot of presentations around higher education and the Wyoming Innovation Partnership. And really, my goal is to allow this to be an open conversation and to have all of our industry partners know that if they have something new come up, or if something is not working, that they don't have to come up with a solution themselves, that this is a collaboration between our higher education institutions, workforce services, and the WIOA group, and then the industry partners. And so I think that if I could just, wave a wand and make that happen, that would be incredible. I think that's going to be a consistent thing that we have to work on. But I do think that our institutions of higher education do a great job of pulling in those partners to give input when they can. So.
Great, thank you. And Andrea, I'm just wondering if you have thoughts as well, having been a long time leader in the employer engagement space.
So at CNN, we bring employers in many, many ways as often as we possibly can. When it comes to the question about how employers might inform what credentials we're providing, we have a cool process at CNM, the college-wide integrated program review, where employers can submit ideas and we jump on them pretty quickly in terms of delivering training. Sometimes it becomes a customized training, sometimes it becomes a bigger program at our college. It's a really cool way to look at the data and the economics and the mission and the market and all that really quickly to inform what we're doing. We were grateful when we presented to the state legislature to talk about this investment in workforce training, that we had industry there at the table who were able to talk about, particularly thinking about some people who own truck driving companies who are advocating for our CDL program, and some from employers from our technology companies. And the technology and the CDL are probably the programs that are having the biggest payoff in the labor market for us right now.
Great, thanks so much, Andrea. And I think just to respond to the question about which, short-term credentials, broadly speaking, have the kind of best bang for their buck compared to bachelor's programs. I think the research that Phil referenced at the beginning is really important. There's huge variation among regions, among credential types, in terms of what ends up having value for the student. I would say, broadly speaking, we see the health fields, some aspects of them, and then more like technical focused certificates often have the greatest return on investment. But again, there's a lot of variation. I don't know if Phil, you wanted to add anything on that.
Finding the mute button here. No, I mean, I think you summed it up really well, and a lot of unknowns there too. So no, I think you summed it up well, Christina.
Great. And sorry, we got a few more questions pouring in. So Lauren, you mentioned the digital wallet, and I said they mentioned we've seen pushes in California and Washington, and actually we know in a number of other states. I think we've seen North Dakota, Kentucky, a whole bunch of states are kind of exploring this. Can you speak a little bit to the value and benefit of the digital wallet initiative?
Absolutely. So there's a number of different options for a digital wallet. Some states are using it. I know, like Utah's got a digital wallet for their driver's licenses and their hunting licenses and things like this. So we're talking about a skills wallet here in Wyoming. The Wyoming Innovation Partnership has invested significant funding into building a digital wallet, and it is within our Department of Workforce Services, and has collaboration in the kind of the working group to build this wallet with our higher education institutions, industry partners, our K-12 partners as well. And so really this digital wallet will be a credentials and skills wallet. And we're even looking at potentials on how do we verify things like soft skills? How do we tie those in, even in our K-12, our high school, juniors and seniors? How do we get those certifiable and building those into the wallet? So right now the RFP has closed and they are sifting through that. So we haven't even started building it yet. But really they have identified a number of different areas that we have credentials. Nursing is one that they, the organization of those credentials are put together very well right now. And that's where they're going to start. So they'll start building that out within the wallet, and make sure with industry partners as they build it, that it's usable, and that it's verifiable and that it's secure, and ensuring throughout this process that our industry partners know how to use it, know that it's happening, and all of those things. And then we will, we'll start utilizing it across the board. I'm hopeful in a number of years after the skills wallet is built out, the state of Wyoming will be able to utilize it for other areas. I think it'll be beneficial on both sides. I mean, if somebody needs I don't know, a certain level of welding certificate for a job that they're working on, then they would be able to easily search and put out to the world. So it's kind of like a LinkedIn, but it's secure within the state and verified, that they would be able to find people that are open for work with that certain certification. And vice versa, for people that are looking for jobs, they can see what's available for them across the state of Wyoming. We have partnered with some other states that have a digital wallet and are looking at, is there some interstate work that we can do across the board? And so I think that there's some exciting opportunities on the future of digital wallets. And I think there's a lot of conversations happening around them. There's a few best practices that have been created. There's not a lot of companies that are building them currently. And so I think as we move through this, it'll be a process. And I think that it will end up being an expectation from our industry partners and our students across the nation as we're moving forward that we have these available. So I'm excited about it. It's going to be great.
Yeah, and I don't know, Marina, if you have anything to add, just thinking of sort of the skill work you're doing around Career Bridge.
I would say too that the workforce board, we were involved with the pilot project that involved a digital wallet that like Lauren's talking about in just a small little project, but it was already proving successful just because these were first gen college students and they were given this digital wallet and they were able to start getting some credentials right away to show success and gave them momentum. And then we also were reaching out and working with a large hospital in the Spokane area so that those students could even get work experience opportunities. So definitely want to just piggyback on the value of digital wallets and digital credentials, because again, young people are like, what? You don't have that? I mean, it's an expectation for folks. And so we just kind of have to keep working for that. I think the harder part is what platform are we all going to agree on? That is the $1 million question. We have a lot of great providers out there that have these wonderful platforms, but we don't have one, and then they all have to be able to talk to each other, et cetera, right? So Laura's nodding her head. Yeah, that's going to be a tough one.
Yep, that will be an interesting one to watch for sure. All right, we have another question from Howard. How do you see a greater uptake, or do you see a greater uptake in short-term credit-bearing or non-credit bearing learning experiences? And then in addition to that, how important is stackability? So kind of micro-credential into degree. And Andrea, I'm wondering maybe if from where you sit, you might have a good view on that.
Yeah, so as CNN, we're seeing an uptake in both, but certainly more on the non-credit side. Our college has one of our strategic goals or KPIs over the next 3 years is to increase enrollment in our workforce training programs from, we're currently at around 6,000 or 7,000 a year to over 10,000 a year. And I know that's possible. It's going to be a bit of a challenge, but because we're seeing that uptake, because we have funding to help pay for it, and because we're really investing in what the future of micro-credentials might look like, I know that we'll get there. But the stackability part of it is absolutely key. We've been doing non-credit to credit for prior learning pathways at our college for over a decade. But we're absolutely looking at how we develop a better system for all of these credentials to stack in a way that our learners can understand what it means and how it makes sense to them. We're also looking at utilizing digital wallets to facilitate that. We started using a digital wallet back in 2017, and we got some kind of like Innovation in Community Colleges Award, which was great at the time, but we haven't really gotten past that pilot stage until like we're now really focusing heavily on what that looks like and how we move beyond that pilot stage. So definitely more to come, sounds like, for all of us.
For sure. And I will just maybe add on that stackability piece. I think that's something we're still really early on in. We're starting to see states, I think, invest in developing stackable pathways more and more. For example, Colorado has done that at the state level, and many other states as well. But we don't know, I think, enough yet about where that works well and where it doesn't. We've seen some research on stackability working well in states like Indiana and others. So I know, for example, in the Virginia's Fast Forward program, they don't see much stacking, and if they do, it tends to be lateral, not kind of going up to a degree. And so, whether or not that's a goal of the program is a question, but I think there's a lot more to learn there. And I know we only have a minute left, so I'm sorry, we might not get to every single question. So maybe I'll just ask for our final, just very brief question. if we do this all right, if we get everything right with short-term credentials, looking ahead 20 years, what do you think higher ed looks like in terms of, short-term credentials being integrated? Is it just degrees? What does it look like? I don't know if any of our panelists have any closing thoughts on that. Marina, I saw you jump
They
off
say,
mute.
because I sort of said this earlier, is like the de-siloing of these credentials. It's across our higher education landscape. They can't just be thought of as they're just this other thing. They need to be brought in, integrated. We need to have access to them. We need to be able to evaluate them. And students need to know that they exist too. So there's all sorts of issues with that, but my fond hope is that in the future, they're just built in and they're stackable and they don't just stub out and you're done and you can't go any further. We have to really be intentional about that.
Thanks, Marina. Lauren?
Yes, I agree 100%. I think that they look very similar to what we have in our 2- and 4-year degrees right now. And that they are tracked similarly, they're funded similarly, that there's scholarships available similarly, and that we can have them available as readily as every other educational program that we have funded, across the nation. So.
Thank you. And Andrea with the last word.
I'll just say ditto. If higher ed looks the same now in 20 years as it does now, then we've failed. So yes, everything my colleague said is absolutely true.
All right. Well, with that, thank you all so much for your time, and thanks to everybody who attended. I am so sorry for the questions we didn't get to. We will follow up directly with you to discuss those. And thank you to our wonderful panelists and to Phil and the team at Pew for their support in this work. We will be posting a recording of the webinar, and we really hope, as we said, this is the beginning, not the end of this conversation, and to continue to work with all of you to further explore many of these still open questions. So with that, I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon, and we will see you all later. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.